Okay, well, we're going to get started. As you probably got the message, we're recording this session just so it'll be available later on our YouTube channels for others to be able to take advantage of it. My name is Tara, and I'm a member of IFLA's STL group, and we're really grateful to have some wonderful speakers here today, and we're grateful that you're here to come learn with us. So today we're going through our first of two sessions for Author Carpentry, and this will be an open access hands-on workshop, identifying reputable OA journals. So a little bit of information about the sessions. Author Carpentry is a researcher-to-researcher training and outreach program in open authoring and publishing, scholarly identity and reputation, and research impact. It's inspired by the modern scientific authoring lesson proposed by Software Carpentry founder Greg Wilson. Author Carpentry was envisioned by founder Gail Peretsman-Clement to complement and extend the research pipelines that are covered in Software and Data Carpentries. Author Carpentry picks up the last mile, so to speak, of the research process: writing, reporting, reviewing, dissemination, and licensing, impact measurement, and establishing author identity and reputation. So today we are joined by two speakers, Allegra Swift and Annelise Sklar. Allegra is the UC San Diego Library Scholarly Communications Librarian. She supports researchers and scholars at UC San Diego from all backgrounds, disciplines, and at all career stages. She helps them use, create, and publish scholarship and research in ways that promote its dissemination, accessibility, and impact. Allegra spends her days infusing research and scholarship support with CritLib, digital citizenship, and digital literacy ideals. Her partner speaker is Annelise Sklar, who is the subject specialist for political science, law and society, and international government information. She is also the assistant program director and research services coordinator for the Research Advisory Services program at the UC San Diego Library. By day, Annelise is a government and information and social sciences librarian who loves reference, classroom instruction, and collection building. In her spare time, she is also a freelance researcher with a knack for digging deep into the literature and statistics. So I'm going to welcome them both. I'm also I forgot to put a little housekeeping note at the beginning here. We have enabled live transcriptions. So viewers, you should be able to click on that button in the bottom if you would like to see the live captioning as we're going along here. But with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to our speakers.
Well, thanks so much, Tara, for that great introduction. And Annelise is going to throw up the slides in a second, but I wanted to welcome everyone and thank you all for taking the time to attend. So as an open curriculum, we're really excited to engage the worldwide community to improve the existing lessons that we have, as well as create new ones. And so we really want to hear about your experiences and your perspectives to ensure that this lesson we explore today is useful to anyone, anywhere. I am Allegra Swift, as was mentioned, and you heard about Annelise Sklar there. Let's see, I'm skipping some introduction here that was already covered. Okay, if you have questions at any point, please put them in the Q&A, and we're also going to use the chat for questions, as well as we have some discussion and we have some hands-on practices that we can use the chat for. As well, we built this workshop remixing some content from a 2020 presentation on deceptive publishing by myself, Annalisa Taylor from UC San Francisco, Natalie Taggy from Temple University, Mitchell Brown from the University of California at Irvine, and Karen Heskett, who's a colleague of ours at UC San Diego. Okay, next slide. The university where Annalise and I work was built upon the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation, a tribe of indigenous peoples of the Americas. And today the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty, cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. And this land acknowledgement statement is a temporary draft currently used by the UC San Diego Intertribal Resource Center. And as a step to take action beyond just a land acknowledgement statement, for this presentation, we've both decided to donate to the UC San Diego Intertribal Resource Center Support Fund. We want to acknowledge that residing in North America and being employed at the UC affords our authors certain privileges in both access to research and in publishing. And we also acknowledge that though we always strive to be respectful, many of the terms that we are using today are often loaded, and we invite recommendations for better terminology. I've given other similar presentations on my campus where we found that predatory publishing is of great concern, especially to health sciences disciplines where there's a high volume of grant-funded research that's being published that also requires public or open access dissemination of the results. We've also found that there's a lot of myth and misunderstanding around journal and publisher evaluation that can result in exclusionary and biased practices. So we're focusing today on how to evaluate possible publishing venues where our biases might cloud our judgment as we consider where we publish our research findings and scholarship. And we'll spend most of our time today exploring evaluation criteria so that you can make a more informed, equitable, and values-based decisions that advance science and scholarship. And so in these slides, they include the links to the articles and other resources we mentioned, as well as a resources page at the end with references to the research and scholarship that we've drawn on to inform this session. And in a second, I'll drop a link in the chat to the PDF of the slides that we're using today so that you can access all the content and the links. Did you already do that? No, okay. There. So the topics for today, I'm going to dive into kind of the background of this issue, set a foundation, and then I'll talk about the criteria and the guides to help authors determine if a publication is a good place to publish in. So we'll look at criteria that is both not useful and possibly harmful, as well as more unbiased and useful criteria. And then Annelise is going to lead us through the hands-on exercises where we'll examine some publications together using the more helpful criteria.
Okay, and I should warn you, you've probably already seen, I have some furry research assistants who like to show off on Zoom. All right, so what we intend to learn today and intend to discuss today is why it matters where a researcher's work is published, some of the core concepts in open access publishing with a focus on academic and scholarly journals, why lists of good and bad journals are always inherently flawed, and how to apply criteria to an open access journal's website, associated people, and content to determine if it is reputable. So how we're going to do this today, as we've discussed, Author Carpentry's teaching is hands-on. So we want the session to be as interactive as possible, but we're not going to subject anybody to breakout rooms. So most of our interaction will probably be in written form. And if we were being 100% sort of pure carpentries today, we'd use something like Etherpad or HackPad or, something that involves Markdown. But to keep things sort of simple and flowing, we're just going to use a Google Doc for the same purpose. So, and we're going to put that in the chat now. Okay, Allegra is on top of things. And so we're going to use this doc to record your responses to the discussion questions. And also we have several journal evaluation exercises. So this is a place to record what you observe. And it's also another place to capture questions that we should discuss, especially if they're lengthier questions that we want to get to at the end. And if you'd like, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the Google Doc now with your name, affiliation, job title if you're willing to share that, and email if you are willing to share that as well. If you would prefer to remain anonymous, that is okay too. And then as for questions, we will try to respond to questions as we go. But if not, we will try to catch up to all of them at the end. But definitely throw questions out, especially if you're having issues with technology or just sort of logistics. And then finally, we also do want to note that we're debuting this curriculum today. We went through it this morning for the first time, and so this is only the second time that we've ever taught this, and we will be revising it based on our experiences with these workshops. But we will be posting that version on the Author Carpentry GitHub space sometime in the near future, once we have it cleaned up enough to share. All right. And so just a little bit more background on why we're here. So for librarians and researchers, publishing is a fact of life, but the publishing landscape is complicated, and choosing journals to publish in, or even just to read, can be difficult as there are many factors to consider. And some of the earlier and initial attempts at creating shortcuts to address these concerns have in turn contributed to bias against certain publications, misunderstanding about criteria for good and bad. And so today we're going to try out some of the common criteria, but address some of the potentials for bias that could be wrapped up in that criteria. So ultimately, the question that we're asking as researchers and librarians is whether this journal is the right place for you or researchers that you're advising. Is this the right place to publish? More bluntly, would you publish here, or would you advise somebody to publish here? All right, now back over to Allegra for the background information before we get to the exercises.
All right, so why do we publish in the first place? What are the drivers that make it necessary to find a publication venue that is reputable and not disreputable? And we would really like to hear from those of you outside of North America, because this is definitely going to be skewed to the kind of drivers that we see here, but we want to understand, what the differences and similarities are in other places. So kind of the drivers that we see are recognition or registration, so that the authors can claim a discovery, a breakthrough, an insight, or contribution to the scholarly conversation. Through solid peer review or feedback and interaction with those who have knowledge in the area, and confirmation that the research is sound and can be trusted. And we also want our research to have some impact on other researchers or other scholars, the public and policymakers. It's important that it can be found and built upon. A good solid record of publication is also necessary to be hired, to be promoted, to receive tenure, and it's also necessary to receive funding and get grant awards. So the characteristics of predatory publishing, part of this issue, this is part of the issue and why we're here today, is that there's people out there who are looking to capitalize on this pressure to publish. And the familiar term for this is predatory publishing. So what is predatory publishing? Predatory journals and publishers are not concerned with disseminating quality scholarship, but are actually more interested in making money off of scholars. A major US government research funder, the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, issued 5 simple characteristics in a 2017 statement titled The Publishing Statement on Article Publication Resulting from NIH-Funded Research. And I will note that it has been said in quite a few articles that these characteristics that I'm about to review also can be applied to the major commercial publishers. So misleading pricing is kind of the first thing, and that's the lack of transparency about the article processing charge, or APC. So often authors are unaware of an APC until they actually get the invoice when their paper is accepted for publication. And I get a lot of emails from authors asking if the library has publishing funds. It's often the unfunded or junior researcher with no other way to pay. Failure to disclose information to authors. So information on publishing charges is difficult to find and often buried, if present at all, as well as other information about author rights, contact information if there are questions or problems. There are aggressive tactics to solicit article submissions. And I've mostly seen emails from what would be considered predatory publishers, but new journals and journals this is a new thing for journals. They're making attempts to be more inclusive and diversify, and they might appear to be aggressive as they engage in outreach. So you shouldn't dismiss just out of hand if somebody's emailed you. Just be careful, but maybe they're looking to bring in different authors and different authors and different editors and peer reviewers. There might be inaccurate statements about the editorial board membership, and this is fairly common. There may be a list of editors who didn't even consent to being on the list. They don't know and might not even be aware that their name is associated with a dubious journal. There might be misleading or suspicious peer review processes. So not all scholarship and research, though, undergo peer review. Dr. Reggie Raju, who's the Deputy Director for Research and Learning Services at the University of Cape Town Libraries in South Africa, states that peer review is not the absolute gold standard in determining quality of the article or journal. The reliance on peer review to categorize whether a journal is predatory or deceptive or not can be damaging. In the article, Predatory Publishing from the Global South's Perspective, Raju and co-authors writes, for journals in the Global South that do not have peer review process, they're doomed to be rated as junk, denying the world access to potentially important research. So the term predatory, as I mentioned earlier, that some of the terms that we use today might be considered problematic. Sebastian Haug writes that the term Global South, which is another thing I've been mentioning, is geographically inaccurate when its use is meant to describe a general rubric for decolonized nations roughly south of the old colonial centers of power. And there are a number of articles that urge us to retire the term predatory, and I think think more in terms of risk management. So you may not want to publish in a journal because it's deceptive or has fraudulent activities, or maybe it's of such low quality for a variety of reasons, from inexperienced editors or publishers, or there could be a lack of visibility or access to the research, reasons that would harm instead of enhance your reputation. There's a group of Austrian universities who educate their scholars on issues of predatory publishing and created this sliding scale to illustrate that anything and everything that does not conform to the standards of scholarly communication and scholarly publishing is not necessarily predatory. Publishing can cover a wide array of practices, ranging from those that are intentionally fraudulent or deceptive to those that could be just considered low quality. This project describes predatory journals and practices as those where publishers have the intent to commit fraud and profit from services that were never provided. So to understand the issue and its drivers, we should really look to the history of publishing. How did we get here? Since the first journal was published in 1665, very little in publishing has actually changed in the last 355 years. The publishers, editorial boards, peer reviewers are usually situated in the global north and predominantly white and male, and this has remained a constant. US librarians Charlotte Rowe, Harrison Inafuku, and the Canadian scholar Leslie Chan and the University of Toronto Scarborough's research team, Knowledge Gap, have produced some enlightening scholarship on the lack of diversity in publishing. Juliet Mitheo Asego of the African Academy of Sciences in Kenya spoke at a 2020 conference on open access scholarly publishing, or OASPA, in a presentation titled OA at Time of Global Challenge, How Has the World Changed and What is the Future? In her talk, she described not only the barriers to publishing, but about the advances in scholarly communication on the African continent that is often overlooked and marginalized. So what has changed has happened actually in just recent decades, such as the internet coming online, which has made it easier to produce journals and to access them. Also, business models of publishers have adapted and continue to evolve rapidly. As the cost to access journals through subscription models has become unsustainable, the open access movement arose in an effort to disrupt and transform scholarly communication. And in an attempt to retain and continue to grow profits, publishers have found other business models to be beneficial, such as pay to publish or the APC on article processing charges. While unethical and deceptive publishing has existed before journals moved online, the proliferation of unscrupulous publishers have also benefited from the author pays APC model and researchers' requirements to publish. So we need to decouple open access from the myth that OA is synonymous with predatory publishing. It just isn't. What open access is the immediate access to research outputs and scholarship that are distributed online, free of access charges or other barriers. Not all OA journals charge an author a fee to publish. This is a total myth. Close to half of all OA journals do not require an article processing charge or APC. And as I mentioned earlier, the major commercial publishers are not above appearing fraudulent when they are lax in their editorial and peer review processes. These publishers will often fan the myth that a publisher brand name automatically means a quality article. Retraction Watch is a blog where stories about retracted publications are collected. With the pressure to publish, authors can sometimes try to game the system. As an example that affected Elsevier, it was discovered when several papers, the authors suggested reviewers were actually fake accounts that allowed for very positive reviews of the manuscripts and no real peer review critique. For some papers, authors actually even reviewed their own manuscripts. And there are many, many, many stories like this on the blog with like the top publishers as well as some lesser or unknown names. So fraudulent publishers and journals are incentivized by profit because there's money to be made, especially off the scholars who need to publish. So a research team that was led by Heather Morrison finds that the APC business model is used successfully by only a minority of fully open access journals. And this is more common in particular subject areas, particularly science and medicine. Journals in biomedicine have had the highest article counts and the highest APCs. The big commercial brand names publishers had higher APCs than journals published by societies, universities, and researchers. A higher journal impact factor correlates with higher APCs. At UCSD, we mostly see APCs around like the 3,000, 3,500, and there's actually, it's rising exponentially. As you can see on the slide, Springer Nature now has an APC of $11,000, over $11,000. Meanwhile, more OA journals and articles are published by universities than any other sector, and this sector is associated with a greater tendency to not charge APCs. And when APCs are charged, to charge much lower than other sectors. So there is an issue also with the supply and demand. Even when I offer to locate a journal for our researchers with low to no APC, our authors will insist on publishing in these high APC and familiar publications. So this is going to continue to be an issue until the culture changes and people are willing to branch out. So why should you be concerned? I've described what predatory or deceptive publishing is and is not, but there are real reasons for not falling for these practices. There are consequences that can affect not only your reputation, but your job and your income. You won't get credit for your work if it can't be found or accessed. You don't want to be associated with a poor quality fraudulent publication, because even if your research is quality, you may be dismissed by association. You may not get funding if it's determined you've made sloppy choices with money and publish the result in a poor quality venue. And we don't want the public putting their faith in charlatans and pseudoscience. We want them to be able to access research for a better informed citizenry that believes in science. I mean, just look at all the things that have happened around COVID and the pandemic. Okay, and on to Annelise for the discussion questions.
So we wanted to sort of set the stage with some of these discussion questions, and we have these 4 questions. They're also listed out in the Google Doc. So we ask that you take a few minutes to share your thoughts on one or more of these questions. These questions are, what are the publishing norms and or expectations in your discipline, or if you're a librarian, disciplines that you work with? What is the gold standard in your discipline or your department? In terms of format and titles, and again, you or departments that you work with. What does your research or scholarship look like? And this is probably a more existential question, but what is quality and who determines this? While you're thinking about that, I also noticed that there is a question in the Q&A about senior researchers who've been held hostage by predatory journals listing their names, titles, associations on the editorial team with no permission sought, and how do we help our researchers resolve this? So I can say, I think we have experience, and Allegra can talk more about this, that we have helped researchers who have submitted to the wrong journal get their paper back, but it did require strongly worded letters that were drafted by the University of California Scholarly Communication Office, where our system-wide Scholarly Communication Office has an expert who does have a legal background.
But actually, so that was a point that I was going to make, was that we could not do that. So what I work with Annelise Taylor at UCSF, who we've both of us have had a lot of these calls from researchers who have their paper's been held hostage. We've had people who've been put on their names on the editorial board, and they just like we were describing. But the legal offices, as well as the librarians, cannot write those letters for the researchers. So what they have to do is they're the ones who have to be in communication, and we just help with some suggested language, some points to make. One of the things was like, you don't need to be threatening, but you need to be very forceful. And the language, we gave them some examples of language that has worked in the past that sounds like legalese, like they've got, and especially since, we're very lucky at the University of California, got some heft behind us. So, just saying what exactly was the problem and how this was harming them, and that they in no way, shape, or form gave permission. And the journals tried to hedge a little bit by saying that they'd waive the APC and all of this, and they were just able to be insistent and get it removed. But in some cases, it doesn't come down, but you're able to show, like if you're going to publish in a reputable journal, you're able to show them that this is not a prior publication, that it was, you have the due diligence as the paper trail. And we've had like some big publishers be very understanding of that and still publish it anyway.
So I hope that at least gives you some ideas for strategies and tactics to take. I see some great responses in the Google Doc. Thank you to the folks from New Zealand today who are sharing some of the expectations in your area about there's an expectation of government funding, and if it's government funded, the publication needs to be open access, but there's an expectation that it's in a journal article and a well-regarded journal. I see somebody specifically saying gold standard is IEEE in nature in their area, or in general, journals with high impact factors. in the
And
business
that's very
school,
similar
there's
to like US, and that's also just it's difficult to get around, especially when they're wedded to a particular title. Yeah, nature is like 5,000 to 11,000.
and I see in the business school, there's even a journal ranking list put together by the Australian Business Deans Council. So again, lists. So these are great answers. In the interest of time, I'm going to turn it back over to Allegra because we have probably too many slides, but please keep those answers coming.
Okay, so next slide. You got it, Annelise, at the next slide. Okay, so how can you tell? In this section, we're going to describe some of the available criteria, the useful and those contributing to bias. So we'll also look at some work that has informed the criteria that we're going to look at today and attempt to apply in the following section. And when we examine some of the publications that we're going to look at. Okay. So you probably all have heard about Beall's list, and Beall's list figures prominently in publications about predatory journals and in many, many librarians' guides on publishing. And we would like to stress how we hope that there can be a shift away from the over-reliance on black and white lists due to their contribution to bias, explicit and otherwise. I am going to go into this in detail because it is so embedded in the literature and the mindsets of many researchers and librarians. There are quite a few articles online that outline this issue, and we've added them to the references, but I'll summarize the points made in an article by Stephen Gichui, Kamotho. And the article's titled "The Storm Around Beall's List, a review of issues raised by Beall's critics over his criteria of identifying predatory journals and publishers." And this is published in the African Research Review. So Kamotho notes that the term predatory journals is often attributed to Jeffrey Beall, and Beall's well-documented issues with open access and his statements about the APC model preying on authors and funders is problematic. So as we mentioned previously, not all OA journals charge APC, and most of the well-known high impact factor journals charge exorbitant fees. Kamotho describes methodological flaws that emerged in Beall's work. There's a dubious basis for entry in this blacklist, over-reliance on the analysis of publishers' websites, and really no deeper than the homepage. Misuse of data and over-reliance on the journal impact factor. Another criteria of a predatory journal, according to Beall, is poor English grammar and the fact that the journals are charging publishing fees. So we've discussed the publishing fees issue, but the language issue marginalized researchers whose first language is not English, as well as research that is published in other languages. The list is one person's personal opinion, and it's highly subjective. Beall would update his list. No other review, no consultation. He's not a person who knows all subjects and topic areas, but his decision was the ultimate decision. So Beall offered all journals and publishers the option to appeal their listing, but only a small number of these successfully appealed and were removed from the list. There was a lack of criteria for individual entries, and by stating the outcome as potential, possible, or probable, still infers that all listed are predatory. And this casts suspicion on newer publishers or inexperienced journals without giving them any room for improvement. Beall has a strong bias against open access. He's prejudiced against OA in favor of subscription-based established publishers. He made it seem as if OA journals were the birth of deceptive publishing. The list is discriminatory to publishing in geographic regions that are less resourced or in developing economies. And Beall has been quoted as naming publications from entire countries as being suspect. And he's also called a respected Latin American research publication database, a publication favela, which is a term for slum. Kamotho and many others consider Beall's list of predatory publishers as an assault against academic freedom. The automatic negative stigma that may be attached to a scientist who publishes in any one of these journals in Beall's list, that even if their work is perfectly valid and academically sound, follows them around much to the detriment of their reputation. This is especially important regarding promotion and tenure committees across academic institutions who may use Beall's criteria as a way to disqualify articles published in journals that the committee has determined fail some criteria but are not truly predatory. Kamotho calls into question its indiscriminate use by librarians who provide this list to students and faculty as a resource without explaining its limitations on the list and of the criteria. So these are some of the resources that are help us look at things less biased. This is the principles of transparency, and this is some of the criteria that we drew on to develop like our criteria and what we're going to practice using today. So we've used the criteria outlined by the principles of transparency, which were built on the Directory of Open Access Journals requirements for inclusion, think, check, submit lists, which have recently been updated and also include newer sections for evaluating book publishers and conference. The principles of transparency was developed by the Committee of Publication Ethics, or COPE, the Directory of Open Access Journals, the Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association, OASPA, which has some fabulous conferences, and I suggest everybody attend virtually or in person, and the World Association of Medical Editors, or WAME. So these organizations have collaborated in an effort to identify principles of transparency and best practice for scholarly publications that form part of the criteria which the membership applications to these organizations are actually evaluated. And the criteria that that they derived are largely derived from and developed from the Directory of Open Access Journals criteria. So, okay, and these examples are some librarian-made tools. On the far left is a tool we created at UCSD, and it's based off of the Grand Valley University Journal Quality Indicators, developed by Sarah Bobian and Max Eckert in 2014. And our colleague Annelise Taylor at UCSF has a guide for evaluating publications. And then there's another group of Southern California librarians at Loyola Marymount University, and they developed this rubric. So the rubric, I mean, it's great, it's very detailed, but it's a little bit complicated. And I'm just not sure if like researchers looking at that will be able to use that. So that's why we're trying to take these tools and distill them down and make them very clear in order for researchers who don't want to spend a lot of time on things. So let's go on to the exercises where we draw from these other tools and criteria and try to find the most useful set of criteria, nothing too short, but not overly complicated for researchers. Okay, now on to Annelise and the exercises.
Okay, so as we mentioned, Author Carpentry's teaching is hands-on. So now that we have a common understanding of the issues and terminology, we're going to spend the rest of the workshop actually trying to evaluate a journal. And so the exercises are all questions based on the criteria from the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE, for the principles of transparency and best practices in scholarly publishing, combined with DOAJ's guide to applying for a journal's inclusion in the directory, which are in fact based on COPE's principles of transparency, and then also the Think, Check, Submit checklist for journals. So what we've done is we've included a list of journals and their websites in the Google Doc, but you are welcome to choose a journal that is one of your own as well. So choose a journal to review for the following exercises. And I guess the one final note about these journals is that inclusion on this list is not any indication of quality, either positive or negative. They're journals that we've encountered recently or have read about. And we thought they would be kind of interesting to test out these questions with. So in this first set of questions, we're going to start with some of the key standards and norms for journal publishing. And I should also mention about these questions, given our time and given that I could be sort of long-winded, I'm going to ask the question and have you start working on it, but I'm going to give contextual information while you are working on it, and we may sort of speed through them. So I do apologize if we seem like we are speeding through them in 45 minutes, but I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. So, okay, so the first exercise isn't actually an exercise, maybe it's a pre-exercise or a note. But the first thing you probably want to do if you're deciding whether or not to publish in a journal is to actually read articles in that journal and decide whether or not those are journals that are of a quality and a scope or topical similarity to the one that you want to publish. So that's just something that we often sort of don't think about doing, but that would probably be the first thing you want to do. The other thing that you probably want to do is to search your favorite search engine for information about that journal. One of the journals on this list is actually one that Allegra and I were asked about recently, and we actually put it through the paces to see how it fared. But we also then Googled the journal and found some unfavorable press about it that certainly gave us pause, and we shared that with the researchers who were wondering about it. So you know, there may be something out there that's just a stopping point before you even have to go through the paces. So our first exercise is to choose, once you've chosen one of those journals, to search for that journal in the ISSN portal and to see whether or not that journal has an ISSN attached to it. And you can search either by the ISSN or by the title of the journal. I actually recommend searching by the title of the journal. We did find when we were testing this out that a journal had used a long dash instead of a hyphen as the punctuation in between the numbers, and that gave us a false no that this journal has no ISSN because of publication when we searched the database. But it's also worth seeing what other journals out there have similar names that appear to be completely separate journals. So why is this important? So an ISSN is an 8-digit code. It's used to identify periodicals of all kinds and all media. It has no intrinsic meaning and does not include any information about the origin or the contents, and is not a guarantee of the quality or validity of the journal. I was thinking about this while I was walking the dog earlier, and sort of had this metaphor of an ISSN is like a license plate on a car. The car is registered, but it's no indication that the driver is actually a good driver. So the ISSN was developed in the 1970s. It's an international standard governed by the International Organization for Standardization. And you know, a journal can publish without an ISSN, but taking the time to register this ISSN is a sign that the publisher is trying to appear professional. But a couple of potentially deceptive tactics. So it's worth confirming that the posted ISSN is in fact associated with the journal and not associated with another journal, because unscrupulous journals have been known to hijack or at least borrow an ISSN from a reputable journal. They may change the wording of their title or the spelling of their their title a little bit, just enough so that a researcher might be misled into publishing with this journal because they think this journal is a familiar journal. So the next exercise is similar in that we recommend looking up the journal in Ulrich's, the Directory of Open Access Journals, or a recognized regional indexing or hosting initiative. And the links to these initiatives are also listed in the Google Doc. And so why is this important? Ulrich's, you may know as a group of librarians, is sort of the classic reference source for finding periodicals. It was first published in 1932 by Carolyn Farquhar Ulrich, who was the head of periodicals at New York Public Library. And this is the authoritative reference source for periodical bibliographic information. Do note, however, that Ulrich's is available only via subscription, and though it's an extremely popular resource, not all authors are going to have access to this if you are not affiliated with an institution that has a library subscription to this resource. DOAJ, on the other hand, is, as we've mentioned, it's the authoritative directory of open access scholarly journals. It is financially supported by libraries, publishers, and related organizations. It covers all disciplines, countries, and languages. DOAJ is a co-author to the COPE Principles of Transparency, and DOAJ has rather rigid criteria for inclusion in the directory. So journals have to apply and prove that they meet this criteria in order to be included in the directory. So if the journal's been included in DOAJ, it's gone through at least one level of scrutiny. Similarly, these journals online projects were funded by INASP, which is the International Network for Advancing Science and Policy. And this is an international development organization that partners in Africa, Latin America, and Asia with the intent to strengthen the global scholarly ecosystem. And so the Journals Online projects were created to increase visibility, accessibility, and quality of peer-reviewed journals published in these countries. And INASP and the African Journals Online developed the Journal Publishing Practices and Standards, known as JPPS, to assess journals on these platforms. And the assessed journals are rated, there are 6 different levels, 3 stars, 2 stars, 1 star, and no star, or journals can be listed as a new title or an inactive title. So again, this is another round of vetting for quality that's already happened. And some of these other entities, Cielo is mostly Latin American open access journal hosting platform. It was started by the Sao Paulo Research Foundation in 1997. They have been, and it now includes many countries from Latin America as well as South Africa. And they've been hosting open access scholarly content for 2.5 decades now. Similarly, Latindex is a directory of journals from Ibero-America. It's begun at the National Autonomous University of Mexico in 1995. So they've also been doing this for 2.5 decades, almost 3 decades. And now it's a regional cooperation network, including 24 institutions from Latin America, the Caribbean, Spain, and Portugal. And then Redalyc is actually another project from the Autonomous University of Mexico. And it is an indexing system that bills itself as the Diamond Open Access Scientific Journal Network. So all of the journals included in Redalyc are, again, they're primarily based in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Spain and Portugal, though I did see a smattering from the United States, elsewhere in Europe, and Africa, and I'm trying to visualize the map now, but it covered, there were journals from around the world. All of these journals, Diamond Open Access means these journals are free, do not have an author publishing fee, so free to read and free to publish in. So again, this is another, they've been around since 2003. So again, about a couple of decades of hosting this open access content. Scholarly databases may also be a good place to learn more about a journal, especially if it's a database with posted policies for inclusion of publications. When I'm teaching undergraduates, I always, I'm the political science librarian, so I always say, worldwide political science abstract, everything in there was chosen because it would be of use to political scientists. So depending on where you search for articles, you can possibly use the fact that you see articles from the journal that you're thinking of publishing in this database as a sign that is not deceptive, but there are caveats. So, PubMed will sometimes index an article or two or a handful of articles, but not the entire journal. So you would actually want to go search the full NLM catalog to make sure the journal has been fully indexed, which means that it's gone through somebody's set of criteria. And then of course, the librarian caveat about Google Scholar is that it's a great place to search for articles. It casts a very wide net, but the journals are not vetted for quality. So just because articles appear in Google Scholar does not mean that they are of high quality. And then just a few bias caveats on top of that. So we mentioned Ulrichs as a scholarly and scholarly databases are generally available by subscription. So that does limit who has access to those resources. Just, when you're thinking about scholarly databases, when they have specific criteria for journals they choose to index, this criteria does usually favor larger established publications whose articles have larger citation counts. And so it can be really hard for a newer journal to get their foot in the door, as there's this vicious cycle of exclusivity where researchers are more likely to cite the work of researchers they already know, and the researchers are less likely to find and cite new content if it's not indexed in these key databases. Okay.
And did you mention they're more likely to be English language, where, that's one of the cool things about the Directory of Open Access Journals is that you can actually limit or search by language. And that's been really a useful, important for we have a strong linguistics department. And so they actually find it really helpful to be able to limit by language.
Indeed.
English.
So databases that are aimed at an English language audience are going to favor English language content, and that cycle then perpetuates itself. So that's a very good point. These other resources, especially these other regional resources, are really good places to find material in the language of those regions as well. Okay, so now that you've searched the ISSN portal and DOAJ or another directory, would you say that the journal's name is unique and not easily confused with another journal? Or is it misleading about the journal's origin or association with other journals? And we ask this because researchers often start their research and publishing with journals whose names they already know as readers or from colleagues. We talked about these gold standard publications. So less reputable journals have been known to choose names that are very similar to those of established journals to try to capitalize on that name recognition and trick authors who would otherwise publish elsewhere. So I mentioned earlier, we had this story at our own institution where a researcher realized they'd submitted their article to the wrong journal, and then the journal didn't want to give the paper back so they could publish it. And they had a lot of back and forth. So that can be very, very scary if people think they're publishing in one journal and in fact, they sent it to a more bogus journal. On the other hand, though, and there was a big New York Times story about this a couple of years ago, some academics will actually take advantage of this confusion as well and intentionally publish in these journals so that they'll have resumes that have a large quantity of citations and journals that sound impressive but actually aren't the impressive journal. So there's a benefit for that too, especially when researchers just need to sort of, crank something out in the publish or perish world. They will choose something that they can get published quickly and sort of move on. And then the next exercise, the last exercise in this section, does the journal's website have an about section or about information? And this is important because first of all, the COPE principles of transparency do state that a journal's website, including the text that it contains, shall demonstrate that care has been taken to ensure high ethical and professional standards. And so to do that, journals should be transparent about their practices with this about section, or something similar with a similar name or concept. And they should include that additional information for readers and authors, such as frequency of publication, whether it is open access or not, the sponsoring or responsible bodies, the scope and purpose of the journal, whether or not it's peer reviewed, the process of peer review, who the editorial board are, what the policies are, author expectations and rights, any publishing fees, and any other information to inform potential readers, authors, peer reviewers, editors, indexers, or librarians about the suitability for interacting with this publication. So, and this information should not be misleading or obscure. And so in the next lessons, we're going to dig into some of the things to pay attention to in the About section and elsewhere on the website. Okay, so this next section, I went too quickly. We're going to be talking about how to identify the qualifications and expertise of the people involved in various aspects of the publication. And okay, so in this next exercise, we ask, is the information provided about the publisher on the website, and does it clearly indicate a relationship to a mission to disseminate research content? And so, there are thousands of journal publishers around the world, but most only issue one or a handful of journals. There are 4 major commercial publishers who are responsible for over 2,000 journals. You may be familiar with them. They're Springer Nature, Elsevier, Wiley Blackwell, and Taylor and Francis. And these big commercial firms, they're responsible for over 70% of social sciences articles and approximately 50% of article publishing in the natural sciences. Though publishing in the humanities does remain distributed for a variety of reasons. So while publishing with a big name publisher doesn't automatically mean the journal is reputable, we've talked about some of their suspect practices. When you aren't already familiar with the publisher, you're going to want to do a little bit more digging before you hand over the manuscript that is the fruits of your research labor and any author publishing fee, especially if it's thousands of dollars. A bias caveat here, though, is that some commercial publishers have found that pressures on authors looking for publishing outlets can be extremely profitable. And so, the market for academic publishing relies on authors submitting their work to publishers for free, and then institutions purchasing that work back from the, purchasing that researcher work back again through journal subscriptions. Newer journals need to publish in prestigious journals in order to gain tenure, and older researchers need to do the same in order to keep their grants. Okay. All right, next exercise. So, is the journal affiliated with or sponsored by an established scholarly society or academic institution? And so I went out and I was actually looking for, what do scholars societies actually do? And I found an article by Robert M. Harrington, who writes about this. He's with the American Mathematical Society, and he says that scholarly societies provide a community support system for academics across many disciplines. And this support can take various forms, such as sharing research and practice, conferences, offering continuing education, mentoring of the next generation, and lobbying. And, so as academia has grown, post-World War II in the second half of the 20th century, and as academic publishing became a larger commercial enterprise, these mission-driven organizations who were initially, sort of lucky to break even, have gradually shifted away from merely trying to break even to trying to generate income and often subsidizing their other activities through their publishing. And so the largest of these societies have become almost like commercial publishers, thinking about Cambridge and Oxford University presses, or, something like the American Chemical Society. And whereas the smaller organizations have often outsourced this work to large commercial publishers. And so, just like publishing with a big name publisher doesn't automatically mean that the journal is reputable or the right journal for you, affiliation with a scholarly society doesn't automatically mean that this is a reputable journal, but it is generally a positive sign if the journal is affiliated with a well-respected society, especially if it's one that you are familiar with. But again, if you're not familiar with the society, or there isn't a society, you're going to want to do a little bit more digging, because again, you're handing over your work and possibly your fee. And also a note that these academic cultures of prestige are derived from voluntary gentlemanly practices of the 18th and 19th century scholars and learned societies. And these established, prestigious, well-known societies and professional organizations are often mostly based in the first world, in Western countries, and their participation usually requires membership dues, travel to conferences, time commitments for service, and these costs can be prohibitively expensive for those without institutional funding and limit the participation to a small elite group of people who do have that funding. So as with publishing, there has been this systematically racist cycle that perpetuates itself by selecting and elevating other white men, though many scholarly societies are now actively trying to change this and support diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay. So our next exercise, and I feel like I am moving very fast here. The next thing to check is the publisher a member of a recognized industry initiative like COPE or OASPA? And I do have, if you are still following along, I feel like a carnival barker here. We do have the links to the membership lists of both of these organizations. Why this is important, again, COPE is an international organization whose purpose is to promote best practices in publishing culture, and OASPA is a trade organization that represents open access publishers across disciplines and around the globe. And both of these organizations have a rigorous application review process, so members are expected to adhere to their best practices. So if the publisher is a member in one or both of these organizations, in theory, they should be aware of and trying to meet these best practices. But do note that while membership fees for these organizations is based on publisher and publication size, for smaller and newer journals and those that don't generate any income, there may not be funding to pay for membership. And if you have a small or volunteer staff, this may just not be a priority or something that you are even fully aware of. So something else to look at, we are on exercise 4 here, are the full names and affiliations of the journal's editors on the journal website? And is there contact information for the editorial office, including a full address? And this is important because, again, you want to know who you're giving your work to, who you're entrusting with your work, and you want to be able to communicate with them throughout the process, particularly when there's an article processing charge involved. Authors and their funders are going to want to know where that funding is going, who is on the receiving end of that. And so we mentioned this before based on the Q&A, listing individuals as editors or on the editorial board or as editorial board members when they have not agreed to do so is an identified tactic of predatory journals who are seeking to mislead authors and readers. Likewise, a lack of transparency about the contact information or location is another signal that the journal may be employing deceptive practices. It may not be what it appears to be. And just a bias caveat on editors and editor affiliation. Editor affiliation is not automatically a denotation of quality, as there are many controversial scholars affiliated with highly ranked institutions. One of the journals that we looked at recently had somebody on their editorial board who is not a climate scientist, but is a climate denier who is affiliated with an Ivy League institution here in the United States. So you can have the credentials, but still be promoting junk science, I guess I will say. Likewise, an editorial board composed primarily of researchers outside of North America or Europe does not automatically denote a lack of quality, especially if the journal has a regional or global focus. These folks might be the experts in that field. And authors and readers who are concerned with issues of justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion may want to actively seek out journals with more diverse editors and editorial boards, as will those trying to reach a more global audience. Okay, so next exercise here, next question. Do the research areas of the editors and other people listed as affiliated with the journal align with the journal's scope and article topics? So this is important because a mismatch between editorial expertise and the intended scope of the journal is a potential sign that the journal has misleading or deceptive practices, or simply that the editors don't actually know this discipline very well and aren't in a good position to evaluate this type of scholarship. And these roles matter because these people are the gatekeepers. They choose the research agenda of the journal. They determine what is automatically excluded or sent or sent out to peer review, and they have the final say over acceptance for publication. Editors and peer reviewers vet the research and they decide which articles are good research, and what is accepted scholarly discourse, or an accepted contribution to the scholarly discourse, and what is worthy of publication. Okay. So, and note too that the entire human infrastructure of scholarly publishing, the staff, the editorial boards, peer reviewers, and academia in general is historically predominantly white and male. And this has an impact on who gets to publish, what the research agenda is, what the research is, who gets to publish, what books are reviewed, and so on and so forth. And just to hit this point home, here is a slide that we've borrowed from Harrison Inufuku, who is a scholarly publishing services librarian at the University of Iowa. And this shows the demographics of the people who work in the scholarly publishing industry, and that they are predominantly white. Likewise, this slide here, which I believe was pulled together by our colleague Mitchell Brown, shows the outside scholarly output from the United States and China compared to the rest of the world. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our last set of exercises where we're going to look at the scope, audience, policies, pricing, and journal content to determine whether a journal is a good fit for an author's manuscript. And so our first exercise here is, does the journal have a scope statement that is well defined and clearly stated? And this is important because the journal's aims and scope should clearly articulate what the journal is trying to accomplish and how it's going to accomplish it. And, so often deceptive journals are going to have overly broad ranging aims and scopes, and they're going to include totally unrelated subdisciplines that might seem perfectly reasonable to a casual observer, and to an expert in the field are going to be like a giant red flag. That said, the flip side is that there are several well-established open access mega journals, many associated with large publishers, that cover every discipline in the kitchen sink. And some of these are PLOS One, ACOS Omega, Scientific Reports, Sage Open, the Royal Society Open Science, BMJ Open, PeerJ, IEEE Access, Open Library of the Humanities, and De Gruyter Open. And a lot of these were started as publishers were just dipping their toe into the world of open access, and these journals have just grown, but they do exist. So it is finding the right balance between, this is a mega journal that covers everything, and this is the journal that's chosen to represent a very weird assortment of disciplines or subdisciplines. But the point of this question is, does this scope make sense for the article you're trying to publish? And does this make sense for you or the researcher that you're working with? Or does it just seem a little off or just plain really weird? So our next exercise here is about the audience, and is the primary audience for the journal researchers and or practitioners. And so this is important because if the point of scholarly communication is to join scholarly discourse and interact with one's peers, authors are going to want to make sure that the work that you've just been slaving over is connecting with the researchers in similar fields who are going to be interested in this work and building on this work, collaborating, so on and so forth. That said, there are many reasons and techniques for communicating to a non-scholarly audience, and one of the driving arguments for open access publication is to make sure that quality information is available to taxpayers and other funders, policymakers, patients, citizen scientists, and any other non-academic who might benefit from access to this information. The flip side of this, just to be aware of, is that junk science can use these same tools, and it can be really dangerous when it informs real life decisions like policy or patient care, whether that's by healthcare practitioners or by how patients decide to treat their own conditions. But again, the point here is that the journal's primary readership and intended readership should match who the author expects to reach with this publication. Okay, next exercise here. Is there detailed instructions to author's information available? And so the idea behind these instructions, they help potential authors prepare their manuscript to meet the expectations of the editors, and they should include information about the journal, such as the types of articles accepted, the language the journal is published in, formatting and style requirements, the peer review process, ethics compliance, author rights and copyright transfer, and publishing options such as open access. So, this should really help the authors prepare a good manuscript and make sure that what they are submitting matches what the journal expects, and what the journal expects matches what they expect. We do have a couple of bias caveats on here on this one as well. We've talked about how English is sort of considered the universal language of science. and early criteria for predatory journals often penalize journals that publish articles in non-English languages or non-standard English. And we also talked about how Western audiences, especially native English speakers or native English readers, will often limit their reading to English language articles, even when this is detrimental to their research, policymaking, or development initiatives. It's apparently a common problem that IGOs will not pay attention to the research output of the countries that they are working in if that is not in English. And I found this really great study by Amano and his co-authors where they were looking at biodiversity conservation research, and they found that 35% of the articles that they looked at in biodiversity were not published in English. So anybody who was only looking at English language material is missing out on research and data, some very critical research and data about diseases and endangered species in the countries where it is being collected and researched. So that is something to think about. And also something to think about here is just the fact that while English may be the universal language of science, it is not the first language of many of the people who are writing these articles. And so I think we just need to be mindful that, you know, I am a native English speaker and I could not even attempt to write a language in French, let alone a language that's more complex or very different, I should say, you know, like Chinese. So I think we all just need to be a little bit mindful that writing a scholarly article in a language that is not your native language takes a lot of work. And we also talked about Raju and Raju's statements about how double-blind peer review does not need to be the absolute gold standard in determining quality of an article or a journal. And there are legitimate reasons for why a journal might not utilize the fully rigorous version of peer review. You know, so you might have journals run by student organizations, you know, the entire legal world, the review is done by law students, not necessarily by other experts in the field. You have journals where the content may be vetted by the editors who should be experts in the field. You may have articles that are solicited to meet a particular theme. So there are very legitimate reasons why articles may not have undergone full peer review. And then, you know, at the same time, even when peer review is the gold standard, you know, there's been a significant amount of research and writing in popular press as well about all of the inherent flaws in the peer review process, from expecting reviewers to provide this labor for free to the lack of instructions and consistency among reviewers. You know, a well-done peer review can help authors improve the quality of their research and their writing, but many reviews just plain lack detail. They don't have constructive criticism. And, you know, sometimes anonymity will embolden a reviewer to be rude. And sometimes reviewers will think they're being anonymous when they are not, and they're not actually anonymous, which has happened to me and my colleagues a few times, which is sort of funny when you actually know who that person is. Okay, so we have a few more exercises. I'm going to speed through them because I am mindful that we only have 9 minutes left. So the next question, are fees or charges for publishing in the journal easily found on the website and clearly explained? And this is a huge one. This might even be just my drop point right here. You know, journals may not have any author publishing fees. Certainly outside of the West, this is often more common that the cost may be covered by an institutional host or grants or advertising or crowdsourcing or library consortia or membership fees. But the most common model or most publicized model is is the article processing charge model, where authors pay the fee to a journal in exchange for the open access publication. And when you're making a decision about where to publish, you want to know how much it's going to cost, because you don't want the surprise bill when these people have your article and won't give it back until you give them thousands of dollars. And especially if the journals, you realize after you've submitted the article that the journal isn't one that you particularly want to publish in, you want to know upfront what it was going to cost. A note here too that many university libraries have been negotiating these transformative agreements that convert traditional journal subscription licenses to this read and publish deal that will cover some or all of the costs for affiliated authors to publish in these journals. The University of California has been really active in this. And these are hugely beneficial because they make research from institutions like ours more widely available for readers around the world. But the unintended consequence is that as this becomes the norm, authors who are not affiliated with the University of California or large institutions don't have the funding to publish in these journals. And previously, in the library pays model, authors with quality research could publish anywhere that would accept them and not have to worry about who was going to pay for that privilege. So it's kind of flipped the burden from the readers to the authors. And also, go ahead.
I just want to jump in on that whole transparency of the APCs. I mean, that's an issue that's not just relegated to novice journals or predatory journals or any of these things. These are standards like in COPE standards, best practices for publishing, that you're supposed to be transparent and have that available. And they're part of the UC transformative agreements, with the negotiating with the publishers is the UCs are really pushing for more transparency, but it's still a problem even among these like major publishers. We're dealing with people who have submitted their article and then to major publishers and then found out much later that an ABC is required, and then they're also it's really difficult to find like what the actual charge is. You dig around, through the website and you're bounced around out to other publisher websites and all, kinds of things. It's still just it's
very confusing. And even when we have these transformative agreements, the paperwork is so confusing. We've worked with some of the same researchers multiple times when they've been publishing with the same publisher because the paperwork is just so confusing and it is so intimidating that, they're afraid that they're going to be on the hook for something that they don't actually have the funding for. So, and that's with major publishers.
Do you think that are we at a stopping point here?
I think we're at a good stopping point because we have 5 minutes left, and I think it looks like there's been some good conversation in the chat. We do have a few more exercises, but we have shared the slides. So I will just zoom on to the end where we say thank you. In the next iteration of this workshop, I think we're going to have less talking and fewer exercises and more time to focus. But if you do have any additional feedback, please feel free to leave that in the Google Doc or email us directly. Do we want to talk about direct marketing? This is everybody's favorite. I think one of the final things, and maybe, is often, though reputable publishers sometimes are a little spammy in their advertising as well, one of the hallmarks of predatory publishing is these emails from journals that you've never heard of, inviting you to publish or serve on the editorial board that may or may not be related to the content that they are recruiting you about. And I was sharing in the last session and with Allegra that I was telling my father, who's a retired researcher, about this session the other day. And he said, "What's a predatory journal?" And I was explaining, it's these journals that may have these deceptive practices. And, one of the things that you often see are these emails from these journals you've never heard of inviting you to publish with them. And he's like, "Oh yeah, I get like 10 of those a day." So even if you aren't familiar with the term predatory journal and you don't recognize all of the deceptive practices, this one seems to be a pretty universal experience for folks in academia these days. And we will skip our discussion questions, but a huge thank you. Allegra, do you have final thoughts?
I'm just in the chat with and asking Catherine about so I'd asked everybody what they thought about whether it's good to have like a bigger long list or shorter, just given that researchers a lot of times they just want a list, they want it quick and dirty, they just somebody to tell them, like it's the same with copyright questions, just tell me whether it's, I can use this or not. And where we're trying to get them to think a little bit more critically. And Catherine was thinking that it would be useful to, you say also invite them to evaluate a journal with you. Sorry, jumping around. Yeah, Elizabeth, someone wants you to tell whether it's good or not. It's like, yeah, like I said, it's the same with copyright.
And I will say, so the basis for these questions, Allegra had built a journal evaluation tool based on COPE and DOAJ, and I think an early version of Think, Check, Submit. And we wanted to rework that. So we said, oh, well, let's see how these questions work as exercises. And I think we've had some good experience talking through them.
And I think it's also being cognizant to like the researchers, place where they are in their career. One of the workshops that I did, there was an established journal editor. She was just really great and she was participating, but she was late career, well-recognized researcher. And then there was somebody who was, very new, early career. And in her lab, she had showed her PI a journal, and he just took one look at the cover and just said, no, not that one. And so when we all reviewed it as a group, we said like, there's certain problems with it, but the research was sound that was in the journal. It looked, that it was quality research. There were just like issues with the website and that kind of thing, kind of novice errors. But, we didn't feel comfortable saying, yes, it's okay to publish in, given that, she has to answer to her PI, who has already kind of dismissed it. So it's like being also conscious of where people are in their career, what the discipline culture is like, the departmental culture. Some are more open to like considering outside of that, narrow pool. But that's just, what we're trying to do there is push the edge.
All right, I think Tara is here to wrap up.
I am. Thank you so much for that really wonderful discussion. I love that you shared the slides and the handouts, because I think those exercises are going to be really helpful. I have already bookmarked those links myself because I'm anxious to see how I can implement that in my own work with my faculty. I'm just going to pull up as a reminder. Can I advance you? Yes, there we go. The recording, again, for this session will be available on the IFLA STL YouTube channel. And thank you again for attending this session. And let's use it as a little advertisement. There's going to be a follow-up session on June 29th. That's 1 week from today with Tom Morrell, and he's going to present on persistent access for research outputs with digital object identifiers. You can find more information about that on the SDS IFLA website. So thank you again so much to Allegra and Annelise. This was awesome. And thank you again for all of our participants for joining us today.
Thank you all. We really appreciate you sticking with us. Have a great rest of your day.
All right, well, bye you two.